The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everybody, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl Hentz here along with Dan Rylance, and very pleased to welcome Jessica King to the program tonight. Jessica is here to talk about her election campaign, the recall election against Senator Randy Hopper. Should mention that on April 7th, there were 23,946 signatures filed to recall Senator Hopper. That's more than 50% of the total votes that he received in winning the seat back in 2008. And the recall election currently, as we tape this on June 2nd, is scheduled for July 12th. That could change as of tomorrow, however. So by the time this show airs, we'll know for sure if the election will be held on July 12th or at a later date, which presumably would, who knows when it would be. Maybe later in July, could be sometime in August, but maybe you've got some insights on that. So anyway, welcome. Thanks for being
Jess.
here. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
And, you know, first of all, is it weird not being on the Common Council right now? You've had a few meetings. That,
it is interesting to pass the torch on and to realize what a big commitment and part of your schedule and daily life. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people remember the Twitter controversy, and now I can actually go to Beckett's on Tuesday and eat my fish tacos and watch the meeting. But
and tweet all you want.
And tweet all I want, right? Well, in a way, right? I mean, but yeah, no, it's been a transition, but I'm actually really happy. I think we got a good slate. I think it shows that democracy works. You know, you get a good slate of candidates. They have the election. People are put into place, and I'm very confident that they're going to do a good job.
All right, excellent. And thanks for your service on the council.
Yes.
You know, for the terms that you were there. Want to talk about your campaign tonight and so forth, but Dan, you've got some information on the constitutional provisions for a recall election held in the state of Wisconsin. Yeah. So can you just kind of shed a little bit of light on it for us?
Because probably none of us have ever experienced a recall election. I mean, they're very odd and they don't happen very often.
Right.
But the idea comes from the progressive movement, where Wisconsin put in their Constitution, Article 13, Section 12, the recall of elective officers, and that could be at any level. The Constitution says you have to have 25% certified signatures of the votes for governor in the prior election, and if those signatures are approved, an election will be held 6 weeks, Tuesday 6 weeks after they've been certified. If the challenger wins, the incumbent is out. If the incumbent wins, that person would continue for the rest of the term. And you can only recall a person once within their term, so this can only happen once in this particular situation. It's very unusual. You know, I don't know how many there have been in Wisconsin.
I think it's 4.
4, okay. So clearly none in the 18th district or any district that encompassed those counties before.
One of them was actually an assembly race up north that occurred after the spear fishing debate. That was one of them, and so that was one. It was just you know, issues of is my elected official representing me? It was actually Jim Holpern, ironically, who was serving in the assembly, and so it will be the first person to potentially face 2 of them.
Wow.
And the other ones, my understanding, were in the southern counties for various issues.
I guess the other point I would make is a recall is not because someone has committed a crime. This is really a political dissatisfaction with the person. And so I think you make that distinction, that it's, if there's a crime committed or alleged crime, you can go the other procedure. Recall is simply allowing the people, if they're dissatisfied with an elected official, they have a constitutional right in the state of Wisconsin to recall that person.
Okay.
So that's where it comes from.
Okay, excellent. And, maybe you know this, Jess, and we'll get into how you became the Democratic challenger for him, but could there be other people who throw their hat in the ring still?
Most definitely. The interesting part of where we're at in this process, this momentum of small d democracy participation, we're at this point where the Government Accountability Board has not yet certified the race. And, if they certify the race tomorrow, that's the official gunshot, at the starting line. And then
no one else could get in?
No, well,
they still could?
That's the opportunity where people who desire to pursue a nomination or to be selected as a candidate would take out their nomination papers.
Okay.
And then they have 2 weeks to gather those signatures. And I believe the number is 600 valid signatures, which when you think about the fact that the populations here have just turned in 23,000 in 5 weeks, I don't think, if there are candidates out there, getting 600 of them in 2 weeks, shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
If there becomes, once the nomination papers are turned in, if there's another, obviously Senator Hopper is Republican, so he's already in that spot. If there's another Republican person who receives enough signatures to be categorized, then that would cause a primary. And then if there are other Democrats or independents or whoever, if there is a need for a primary, that becomes the election after the 6-week time.
Okay.
And then the general election would be 4 weeks after that. So there
A lot
could be
of
other
dates
people.
here to keep in
I know,
mind.
floating dates,
Yeah.
which
Do
is
you
the
know
problem.
of any other candidates, either within the Democratic Party or independent, that have expressed interest in running?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I've not heard
Yeah.
anybody put themselves out there.
Okay.
And that's the interesting thing about my effort. If there was somebody right now besides me who had announced their intentions to run, I filed papers with the Government Accountability Board, and right now the papers indicate that I'm running in the next official election, which is actually the 2012 election. So that's really the only appropriate way at this point. If anybody did have that desire right now, they would have to be registered with the Government Accountability Board for the next election.
Are you a nominee at this point of the Democratic Party?
No.
No, okay.
No.
Okay.
Right.
Wow, this is like a moving target. I mean, it really is. Like
Yeah.
you said, floating dates and a lot of dates to keep track of, different numbers of signatures required
Yeah.
to keep track of, legal challenges like
Right.
you wouldn't believe, and it's just it's crazy.
Yeah, and the irony for those people that are like, oh, I'm going to go be a candidate, one of the first things people give you advice about is, well, you need to build your campaign plan based off of when the election date is and move backward, and then they say, oh, you need to know what your vote goal is, and those things are pretty elusive right now as a candidate. Who knows what the turnout for an election is going to be in the summer.
Yeah.
That's would be a
Very,
really historical, really great time for people to kind of bone up on their civics and learn and participate in their democracy.
So once the Accountability Board moves forward, then you would go to the Democratic Party of the 3 counties for a nomination?
No, what happens is when the nomination papers themselves, I put forth
Right.
the party that I am participating
Okay.
in. So my nomination papers say that I am running as a Democrat in this district, in this seat.
Okay.
And then, if there would be other candidates or other people circulating the nomination papers, if I can get enough electors to sign that, then I am registered as a Democratic nominee.
You're officially the nominee then?
Right. If
Okay.
I turn in, the signatures have to be turned in with the Government Accountability Board. They have to be validated. Once they are, I am a nominee.
Okay. But if someone else files a petition that's certified with 600 signatures who also wants to run as a Democrat, then you would have to have a primary?
Yes, that's
Okay,
right.
all right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Sure.
And also, recall elections are not covered by state campaign finance laws. So, that means there's no limits on what can be spent or what can be contributed and that kind of thing.
What does that mean to you?
Well, it's an uphill battle. I don't know if any of you have seen the news recently about the ability for individual donors to give $20,000.
Right.
And that gives a lot of voice for one person to do something like that. What's interesting, and this is another part of the Government Accountability Board registration process and being a transparent and open candidate, is that the money that I'm raising right now as a candidate technically goes against my limits for 2012. So hypothetically, because the recall election hasn't been certified yet, all the money that I'm raising is going against my 2012.
Why would they penalize you for a recall election?
Well, it's not really a penalty. It's just the nature of the law. There's really no provision for it. To register yourself as a prospective candidate, you have to tie yourself to a race.
I understand.
And so right now, this is still a hypothetical race until they certify the date, which hopefully will happen tomorrow. It's technically hypothetical still. Which is very challenging for candidates to be viable in this day and age of, trying to understand how to approach donors and raise money, and to appreciate that, let's face it, some of my donors are people who can give me $20 or can give me $5 or give me what they can, and they're cycles of, it takes them 6 weeks to save up that donation, or it takes them time, and in this process there isn't time. That's the one resource that's not on my side. So.
And your opponent, Mr. Hopper, is out there, and he's already got a sizable war chest. I mean, and the fact that you're not even the nominee for the Democratic Party, I'm assuming that they're probably not committing money to you at this point either, or is that an incorrect assumption?
Right. There's no. I mean, to be frank, I'd have to look through my campaign finance report at this point. There's an opportunity for campaign party donations, but they're limited. It's under the same limit that, let's say, a political action limit would be under.
Okay.
So at this point, I have been raising money. I do have contributions. I couldn't give you specific details on who or how much, but if they were, it would be reported. It would be in my finance report.
Okay. All right.
So.
You want to talk a little about the campaign now, as far as who's running it, or you have something?
Clearly, this race is not to diminish your candidacy or Senator Hopper. This is really a race that has statewide implications. So I would think that state money or national money is going to flow into your campaign as well as his. I mean, this is a union fight. So I would assume that once you're certified now, that you're going to get recipient of a lot of union money.
Well, I think it is the lines are kind of, I think people really, as I talk about the election, I don't mean to give it extra importance, but I think just the nature of the grassroots swell and the way things are lining up, I think nationally how things are lining up, people are really putting a incredible amount of pressure, on the candidates and on this electoral process.
Control of the state senate.
Right, and control of maybe the vision and the direction. And I think people on the left are saying, hey, this is an incredible overreach. This is against our values. This isn't what we signed up for. You ran on a campaign of job creation, and we're doing everything maybe but job creation at this point. And so they're saying we want to take back the overreach. And then nationally, I think people are seeing this playbook coming out of the special interests. The ALEC organization that has this template of legislation, and they're shopping it to all the state jurisdictions, and this legislation is being passed word for word in various jurisdictions. And I think some people are saying, hey, wait a minute, each of the 50 states are different. We have our own traditions, we have our own values, and I think for most of us, we'd like to think that there is some deliberation and that there are amendments and that things are tailored to our specific cultural values. And I think in Wisconsin, we have historically for generations, we've been leaders in senior, leading to make sure that seniors have access to health care and prescriptions. I mean, senior care is a model nationally. We have led the way in education. I mean, we're the state that founded kindergarten. We have always put a priority to say the way our population succeeds is through having job skills and education. I mean, so there's just these things that we really our values, our historical values, to say that this cookie cutter legislation that's being shopped around by those organizations maybe doesn't really fit here. And so I think what's going to happen is there are going to be large sums of third-party money getting involved in the race. I would say, to be frank and candid with you, in 2008, there was national, statewide money involved in that state Senate race I ran in 2008 because it was an open seat. And it was, when you have open seats and there aren't incumbents involved, third-party organizations like to stir the pot a little bit and say, hey, what can we get here? And, you know, it's one of the things where personally I feel the last administration could have done something about campaign finance reform, and I think should have. And I've always been a big believer in that. And now, you know, here we are again seeing this, that campaign finance, the lack of the reform or the lack of structure. You know, I'm sure when they put this constitutional amendment in for the recall elections, they didn't intend to not have unlimited spending. Yeah. It just was something that was not perceived when they put that into the Constitution, that something like this would happen. So now the incumbent candidates have the ability to build the war chest to protect themselves. And in the end, I think that undermines democracy. Mm-hmm. Because then if you are dissatisfied and you do have buyer's remorse or political candidate remorse, whatever you want to call it, that makes it ineffective. And I don't think that's what the constitutional fathers, mothers, you know, framers thought that was possible.
So if you were successful in unseating Mr. Hopper, is that kind of something that you would take on as a goal
yes.
in your tenure or your term to extend those campaign law, finance reform things to cover this kind of situation?
Yes,
as well?
I think they should be, and and honestly, I think a lot of people are you know, looking at this process and maybe comparing it with the other states and saying, well, you know, if we're going to do a recall, how do we do it? And that's interesting because the 50 states all do it very differently, and it's you know, some states even have two processes. You know, one, you have the election for the recall, and then if the citizens agree with the recall, well, then you do the separate election. You know, some states, like in California, it's a two questions on one ballot even. I mean, there's all different ways to do it, but I think finance, you know, the prior administration was successful, and they got some campaign finance reform for the Supreme Court races. Now, we just saw another race in April. I don't know if it was effective enough because I still think there was a lot of money involved in that. And I don't think it's one of those things where, on one hand, you'd like to think that money would provide more transparency and more ability to know the candidates, but it seems to just really increase the soundbite nature of candidates. And then, you know, whether you have access to genuine opinions or genuine platform, it's very difficult, I think, for the average citizen to feel good about it. And to be frank, you know, as I talk to citizens, I think they're skeptical of everyone at this point. You know,
Sure.
As a candidate, it's hard to overcome that.
Before we go any further, do you have a website for your campaign that we can plug into the computer and get brought up throughout the show?
Sure, it's JessicaKingForSenate.com.
JessicaKingForSenate.com.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's unfortunately right now, it's a very very simple, very basic. One of the struggles for this, you know, candidacy is the time crunch has been incredible, and so things aren't as detailed as you like them to be. And, you know, for any, you know, that's just part of the problem, I guess, with this race, is it's harder. But I think people, you know, hopefully they do have some familiarness with the candidacy, with the candidates from the 2008 race. But, you know, things have changed too. So that's why I didn't want to just throw my old website up and say, you know, I know this information isn't current. You have to have time to edit copy, and I'm running out of time, you know. So, but
Jessica, are your campaign people from in-state?
yes.
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 Okay.
You know, I know there are some volunteers that have worked on other races in the state. They were involved in the 2010 elections. So, for example, there's some volunteers that had worked on Paul Cisney's campaign, who had been a race in Fond du Lac for the Fond du Lac Assembly seat. And you know, it's really good to find these folks that have worked on other local races, have developed some level of familiarity. I know some of them are people who haven't always lived in the state.
Yeah.
Your
Your opponent clearly has out-of-state people running his campaign, though, doesn't he?
Oh, I've heard that. I've seen the
It's
article.
that cookie cutter thing you mentioned before with laws, but also it applies to local races, where there's this batch of people they bring in from other states to run these type of elections.
Right. And I definitely can't afford the East Coast consultant. You know, I'm still.
Well, and that's where Jeff Harvey, Hopper's campaign manager, came from, is the East Coast, is what I understand.
Okay, I just wanted to make that.
Yeah. I mean, I've got maybe a kid who's from Illinois that went to
Right,
college
but
here or something. I mean, you know what I mean? I'm not going to say they're all born and bred here, but I mean, they're
not a pro of running elections in
Yeah,
other
we definitely
states.
don't have the bankroll for that kind of consulting.
Let's talk some specifics here, Jess. You announced your candidacy before the recall petitions were even certified. Why did you kind of get a jump on that when you did?
The signatures were turned in on, I think, April 7th, I think was the date.
So, yeah.
And then I had my announcement on April 13th. But you know, I was following the grassroots movement. I mean, I was like, wow, is this really happening? You know, and I have to say, you know, as a candidate, sometimes you get a little like, oh, I don't really know, are the people really behind this? You know, is this, you know, you run an election and you lose by 82 people, and it was obviously a very close race, and I took time off of work. I had left my job. I had campaigned for 13 months, and for me it was kind of a, is this really happening, you know? And then I myself, you know, had my feelings about what was happening, and saying, you know, I ran in 2008 because I really just wanted, you know, I'm sick of the sound bites and the lack of productivity and the lack of genuine conversation where you can say, you know, maybe we don't agree about everything, but let's have the conversation. Let's discuss the amendments. Let's talk about, you know, does the budget go to our values? What are our priorities? You know, and that's something I really got out of my city council experience, was that, you know, Oshkosh, we now have a strategic plan. We now budget toward our priorities. We've really come a long way in the last 4 years, and that's something that, like, does the state do that? Do we really have a metrics of, you know, does the state budget match our priorities and values?
Yeah.
You know, and I think right now, the current administration, I'm in conflict with the way they're budgeting. I'm in conflict with the massive corporate giveaways to out-of-state companies at the expense of our values of, you know, dignity for our elderly, opportunities for our kids, conservation of our resources, you know, maintaining our local community infrastructure. I mean, how loud and how many times do you have to hear a local community saying we want freedom from flooding, we want our roads done, and yet we want good schools, we want these things. And basically the state administration is saying, we're cutting off that shared revenue, you're not getting it. They're passing the buck. They're passing their budget problem to us. They're not decreasing the mandates. I mean, the one mandate that was proposed was to end this recycling, which I was like, hey, wait a minute, we've just spent 2 decades trying to educate people, and we just finally, and the nice thing is, you know, as much as I know people don't appreciate the blue cards. You know, I don't even appreciate them in the winter because it really is a hassle, right? But we are saving so much money on that garbage tipping fee. It's actually become a benefit for the city budget, and that's something to really be proud of. So when you have the state administration saying, oh, well, we're gonna, and they haven't done it yet, you know, maybe they'll put the money back in because the budget's not done yet, so I don't want to be completely throwing them under the bus, but the proposal was, we're gonna get rid of the state portion of the recycling money. So that was something like $350,000 for the city of Oshkosh alone, which will then, if we can't fund the recycling fully or can't figure out how to do it, then that means people would be more likely to put the recyclables back in the trash. But the state administration was not going to get rid of the tipping fee, you know, which the tipping fee is supposed to fund the shared revenue that supports the recycling. That's how that's supposed to work. And that tandem understanding of what they were proposing wasn't there. So anyway, on and on, right? But that's you know, it's part of the reason to go forth with it. And I saw the momentum. I saw the people saying, yeah, we want to participate. And I wanted to offer an alternative because I think, you know, for any recall to be successful, you have to have an alternative. And I really felt this responsibility of, I know how hard a race like this is. I know what the geography is, the territory, the time. And I was like, you know, when you lose by 82 people or 163 votes, you know, over 84,000, almost 84,000 people, you know, that's really close.
Yeah.
Just a sort of a personal thing here.
Sure.
This is kind of a lucky break for you in a way. I mean, obviously a recall election wasn't in the cards. It's not a normal sort of thing. You didn't get the judgeship that you had applied for. You were in the and for whatever reason you decided not to run for the Common Council. So all of a sudden, you know, in the middle of this first term where the person only beat you by 162 votes, this recall cloud comes over the 18th district, and boom, you've got a recall. I mean, that was kind of lucky.
It's an interesting phenomenon. I have had a couple, you know, reporters ask me, "Oh, well, did you know?" And I'm like, you know,
you're clairvoyant,
right? Where's my crystal ball? If only I could predict other things with such accuracy. But you know, and that was one of those things that I had filed my application of non-candidacy in November or October, and
But not anticipating a recall election.
Not honestly. Have really was thinking about doing some other public activities and other public outreach things that I thought, oh, that would be helpful. So it is an interesting turn of events.
Yeah, lucky for I mean, in a sense.
Well, maybe lucky, or wait
But
till after the day after election day. We'll talk about it.
At least the opportunities are. Well, one other thing. This is a recall election, and those people who have signed that signature have already committed themselves, in a sense, to vote against the incumbent. Are you going to run a campaign that basically supports that view that he has to go, or do you feel obligated that you also have to present an alternative program to back up why you should be elected?
Right. I think, people are going to go to the polls for all sorts of reasons,
right.
But I still personally feel the obligation as a candidate to develop the contrast, to
right.
say, I really think that, Senator Hopper and I have very different priorities in budgeting, just the way we view things, and that's not me being negative about him. It's just saying the way we go about prioritizing government initiatives.
Sure.
He is someone who is willing to say, well, I believe that if we give these tax breaks to these corporations, that somehow they will spin off to job creation. And then I've been very critical of that, saying, if you don't write it in the legislation for accountability, for specific results, and for penalties for not reaching the results, if that stuff's not there, there's not going to be this benevolent spin-off of job creation when you do that. And then on the flip side of it, I think you have to be really long-term with your budgeting and with your goal setting to say, those investments we make in job training with the technical schools, with our K through 12 education, with the UW system, those are things that prepare our population for high-wage jobs. Mm-hmm. Okay, and if we don't load that in the front end, we're going to have bad results in long term. And you won't notice it right away.
Right.
But it's something that I think all of us, we can kind of appreciate that.
But you can't deliver on anything that would not be supported by the Republican Party if you're elected. You're only going to be a member of a state Senate that will either be still controlled by the Republicans or narrowly controlled by the Democrats after all of these recall elections.
Right.
The Assembly is still controlled by the Republicans,
right.
and the governor is. So you're at best you're a protection for Democratic interest if the Democrats would control the Senate. But your idea is, what is the Democratic idea to eliminate a $3.6 billion deficit? I've never heard of one.
Well, I'll tell you what. Actually, this is going to sound interesting. My research, and this is coming from my Common Council knowledge, has a lot to do with going back to looking at the Kettle Commission report.
Okay.
And I feel that the Kettle Commission was really one of those things that the plan had been put together, the executive summary's there, it got put on a shelf.
Yeah.
And part of it is because there wasn't the political will to pursue government reform, because it wasn't this, it's not a quick fix.
Yeah.
We want quick fix. We want the magic pill. That's just kind of part of American culture, and it works really nice in sound bites, But the point is, sometimes, and we've seen it on the Oshkosh City Council, sometimes it's a lot of plotting, and it's a lot of long discussions, and it's a lot of slowly made ordinance, slowly made resolutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned that. I've cut my teeth on that locally, and I really believe a lot of what the Kettle Commission talks about. And I think we've seen good reform that's kind of been organic at this point, with the county and the city talking about merging the health departments, and the Winnebago County, Brown County, Outagamie County saying, we're going to merge our recycling programs, and then looking at the fire department working with the townships. And I think there's something to be said for the Fox Valley, in that we've already demonstrated that we are good stewards, we make good decisions, we don't always levy to the max, we have a track record for being frugal, but the problem is the way the state administration is dealing with the budget right now, they're doing an across-the-board cut, across-the-board line, no thinking through it to say, wow, there's some jurisdictions that haven't been good stewards.
I agree, but the budget is going to be approved before if you're elected. So, you can't do anything for the next 2 years.
Well, you know what? I can advocate for it, and I can draft the legislation, and I can say, let's get back to the Kettle Commission.
Sure.
Let's talk about real policy, and that's the benefit I have, is my background is in policy.
I understand that, but you were entering an incredibly partisan Madison legislative body. If you defeat Hopper, you're a persona non grata among the Republicans. They're not going to listen to you. And they control things. So you can give, I support your idealism, but practically speaking, until you would win in 2012 and the Democrats by some way would control state government, those things aren't going to go anywhere.
Well, you know what I think though is that what it does is this partisanship. I like to think truly good ideas aren't necessarily partisan. The point is, government has gotten to the point where no one can sit down and have a conversation and say, how do we compromise? Right? And we have to get back to that. And I'm going down there with that same spirit of let's focus on the things we can agree on. Let's have these conversations and let's get it started. And I'm not going to not try that.
No, I understand that.
And I think the examples from the city council are really evident. I was on some very divisive city councils, and when I could find the opportunity to agree with council members, I'd take it. And our votes had always been, the dynamics changed on the city council depending on the issue. And I have that experience, I have that in my identity, and I respect it, and I respect my Republican colleagues, in the sense that, I believe, they want to be good stewards, they want to be responsible, whether or not we have the same priority of how we go about things may not be true, but I think the underlying thing is any elected official needs to have some results, right? Because that's the most frustrating thing, to ask for someone's vote, get elected, and then have no results, right? And so I'd like to think that if we do get in this gridlock, we can at least work on some things, find the things we can work on and be productive for people. And I'm going to try it. I'm going to do it,
Well, I'm glad to hear that you are willing to and able to see yourself reaching across the aisle, with partisan type issues, because Dick Spanbauer from the State Assembly was able to do that with the, the collective bargaining budget repair bill issue. And, when he was on the show, he said that he was very forthright in telling us that some of his fellow Republicans said, we agree with you, Dick, but we're not going to go against our party, and we're not going to go against the governor. And that's shameful. That's a shameful way to approach government. And, I give them, I don't agree with everything that he votes on, or the way he votes, but I certainly give him credit for doing, a courageous thing, I think, in going against his party, and I'm glad to hear that you would do the same. You've mentioned the Kettle Commission a couple of times, and, since that report was done
a long time
many
ago,
years
wasn't it?
ago,
Yeah.
and our population here has changed over the years, there's probably a fair amount of viewers who either don't know what the Kettle Commission is because they didn't live here at the time, or maybe they have forgotten about it. Can you maybe just kind of give us a snapshot of what it is?
Briefly. And actually, this is the great thing. I think it's another opportunity just to show that partisan ideas aren't necessarily bad ones. Like I'm a Democrat, a known Democrat, and the Kettle Commission was actually impaneled by Governor Tommy Thompson. And it was initiated by a Republican governor who was interested in government reform, but the commission itself was nonpartisan. It was really focused on experts, policy experts, to say, what's our future vision for Wisconsin? What are our local values and frameworks that we need to be sensitive of? And then how do we go about government reform with that lens over it, that there's certain priorities that are incredibly important, or, these are the things we're going to be mindful in our planning assumptions. And it really talked about, in the executive summary in particular, it talks about the priority we put on education for the reasons I explained before, that we need a trained and qualified, educated workforce, and culturally for generations we believed in that. The next thing it focuses on is the use of technology, that it was the Kettle Commission's goal for the government to really embrace the technological efficiencies that are available. Other one is really just this idea of how do we reevaluate the way we deliver services? And I think a great example, that I use just to give a easy, an example to understand. Wisconsin has 72 counties, and you may be familiar that our county seats are all a day apart by horse ride, and that's how they were established. That was the reason, okay? In California, they have something like 52, 54 counties for the whole state of California. We have 72. Now, for small d democracy purposes, for citizen engagement on policy making, that's a good thing. But necessarily, is it a good thing for the way we deliver every service? You know, the counties are the arm of the state. You know, the state creates the mandates, the counties all deliver them. You know, are there other ways to have counties cooperate, have local units of government cooperate to develop services and to make sure that they're still efficient, but that they're not duplicative? And I think that exploration and then finding a way to not be offensive to local municipalities, because I can understand that because of my background as a local elected official, to say, you know, what we need to do is not say you must consolidate X, Y, Z, but just to empower the local governments to say, figure out where your comparative advantages are. And the more effort you put into that, the more we will acknowledge that this group of municipalities is a good steward. And then that way, when we're looking at our purse strings for whatever grants, whatever state aids we get, whatever, you know, these other open pools of money, that becomes an acknowledgement in the application process for those grants. What is your effort in implementing these kind of reforms? How are you being good stewards? And I realize that that's really complicated, and I realize that would be, it's very deep. It's not an easy thing to do. But that's kind of who I am. You know what I mean?
Am I hearing you say you would support a constitutional amendment to reduce the number of counties in Wisconsin?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, I don't have a problem with the structure of the counties because of small d democracy, participation by people. But the point is, you know, and I think the good example, and I know there's goods and bads about it, but when you look at family care and how family care is being delivered now, it used to be that was done by each county.
Right.
And then now what they've done is they've merged counties into districts for the provision of services. And
So
that
keep the existing counties, just share resources.
right,
Okay.
and cooperate. And so the same thing with the example I had before about the tri-county recycling.
Okay.
Say the unit of government is sound. It's there. You know, the people have the ability to implement, and they have the ability to say, yeah, we want to participate, or no, we don't, which is exactly the debate that's going on before Winnebago County and the Oshkosh City Council right now about the health department.
Right.
So I'm not talking about that. You know, that to me is, you know, I respect that, the autonomy. But this other idea of, you know, the state empowering that, and I think the other example of where maybe the previous administration dropped the ball has to do with the Regional Transit Authority spending. You know, the state.
You keep using the word. You're talking about the Doyle administration.
Yes,
Okay,
Doyle
all right,
administration.
okay,
Sorry,
all right, no.
the Doyle administration had this opportunity to allow counties and municipalities, or regions, to have some autonomy in determining how they would provide for regional transit, and we didn't pass because they you know, for whatever reason, the political will wasn't there to do it. And now, with this new budget repair legislation, with the collective bargaining legislation, we've jeopardized $43 million of federal transit aid. And this really hamstrings local communities because they don't have any ways to generate revenue or to determine how they're going to provide for transit. But now this money isn't coming in, potentially, depending on what happens with the court battles,
Sure.
etc. But it just shows that, you know, we have to find these ways to encourage good stewardship, and then sometimes encouraging good stewardship means allowing a little bit more local control for people to figure that out for themselves. You know, and I don't have a problem with that.
Just one more.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
What are constituents telling you about why they are most upset by Randy Hopper? I mean, and then what are your responses to them?
Sure, the number one, it has a lot to do with democracy. I think principles or anger, mostly. They feel that Senator Hopper wasn't listening to them, that you know, he got elected 3 years ago, and that he went to Madison, and that they really hadn't seen much of him after he was elected. So the preemptive listening sessions and the availability and the communication level, and then once
Now, he's not being a good representative of the people that sent him.
well, building the foundation of that, you know, what's the expectation, and then obviously in the last few months we've had this kind of uproar. The 144-page document of legislation gets introduced, and then they want to vote on it 5 business days later, and then people are trying to call the Capitol. They're trying to contact their legislature, and the representative's phone gets turned off, the not available thing, and then we transition into a certain amount of chaos that I think people are very uncomfortable with on both sides. That was a very uncomfortable situation, and then I think the fact that it passed then and people felt really shut out, and I think that's what they're most upset about.
I want to talk about district representation a little bit, because obviously this is the senator seat for the 18th Senatorial District in our state. And one of the complaints that we've heard about Mr. Hopper is that, people, when they go to see him at his office in Madison, they don't see him. They are greeted with a staffer, if they're greeted by anybody, and then they're asked if they live in the district and so forth. Now, I get the concept of district representation, but by the same token, a state senator is being paid a salary with everybody's tax dollars, and he or she is making decisions that affect everybody in the state. They don't just affect people in their particular district. So if you are successful, Jess, in unseating him, and someone approaches you about an issue, whatever it may be, and whatever side of the fence they're on, are you going to be, keeping a little log as to who's in your district, and if they don't live in the district, well, you're not going to listen to them, or how are you going to do that?
Well, I think first responsibility is to your constituents, because they are your electoral population, and one of my personal frustrations with a lot of things that are going on is the access that lobbyists really do have into the chambers and into the Capitol, and then the irony now of us trying to shut people out of the Capitol when there's something really, to me, wrong with that. My goal, if elected, is to make sure, one, that I am incorporating local people into my staff, because I think that's important, to have people who really understand the localities that we serve. And then I think the other issue really is to make sure I am meeting with my constituents, the people who live both in the rural and urban areas, and that, when these issues come up, that you really do take a poll of the sensitivities. I'm not saying that I'm going to take a tally, because I don't believe that's how the decision making happens, because obviously then urban or Oshkosh would dominate, in that decision-making process, right? Because it's the highest population center, or, to take percentages. I don't think it works that way, but I think you have to be sensitive to how legislation impacts the district, what are the needs, how do you balance it. I also think there's an important point to have more listening sessions in the district when things come up. One of the things I was really impressed with is that when Joint Finance didn't schedule a budget hearing here in the 18th Senate District, that it organically happened, and there was a local community budget hearing, and that there was some other independent groups that said, well, you know what, if the Joint Finance isn't coming to us, we're just going to have it ourselves to talk about the consequences of the budget. But I think for myself as an elected official, I find that as part of the job description, that you need to do that. And obviously right now I live up here in Oshkosh, but I'm going to make it a priority to be available in the other parts of the district. I think it's important. But I think the number one priority is, I do believe constituents are first, but then I also think there is a role just in self-education about the issues. And I think at some point you have to say, where do you get your information from? Try to be balanced with the research. And I think that's the point where some of that maybe does come from folks outside of your district, whether it's the UW Extension, whether it's a nonpartisan organization, where is the information? But then I think you have a responsibility as a representative to then bring that information back in and somehow vet that with the constituents and say, this is what the basis is for the legislation.
Because Senator Hopper even sent out a form letter to people who were contacting him. He emailed them a form letter in which he complained about the fact that there were so many emails and phone calls and letters that he was getting from people, so many that were coming from outside of the district and outside of the state, that it was impeding his ability to get back to people in, his own constituents. I get that also, but this is a man who also is not afraid in the least to take money from outside the district or outside the state. I just think it's important that an elected official, yes, give their due diligence and their, primary attention, I guess, to their constituents, but you guys are making decisions that affect everybody, and therefore I think you've got an obligation to listen to people, especially when they are also paying your salary. And I think the cost-benefit analysis as you look at legislation, as you are making, because that's what they're doing, they're making policy decisions. Part of our fiduciary responsibility is to look at the overall impact. What does that do to the overall impact, quality of life, financial consequences of the district? Those totality of circumstances, if you will. You got to look at it all. Sure.
It starts with the constituents, but then in the end, you have that fiduciary obligation to do what you think is in the best overall interest, and then that's when you do the balancing. So I think there's a combination.
Okay.
Comment on the recently passed voter ID bill. Senator Hopper said in a news release that the purpose of this bill is to protect the democratic process. Is there voter fraud in the 18th district that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
One of the things, this is an interesting conversation. I am a lawyer by profession and trade, so when I sometimes take a different lens to some of this stuff about where is the fraud or what is really happening. And from my research and understanding, the couple places where there were issues with fraud really had to do with felons voting inappropriately, people who had felony convictions that didn't have the education level or what have you to realize that, hey, I'm not supposed to be voting. And the way to solve that problem really would have been to, when you do the voter registration card, when you go to vote, is if they would add a checkbox on that sheet saying, yes or no, have I been convicted of a felony, or am I,
Do you think people would answer that honestly, though?
Well, but the point is, then you have that additional overt action. Okay. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, but then you have that, hey, you were warned, and I think it gets the, you don't want to we don't legislate just to take care of bad apples, we legislate to take care of the whole barrel, but you want to make sure you've got that. So I put it this way, that's how I feel as a lawyer. Like if fraud and protecting that process was the issue, my thought is, will you take care of the most egregious thing first, and the most egregious documented, researched out place of fraud that I have understand to exist is with that problem, not with the photo ID issue.
The issue that's been made by a lot of Democrats is that this bill is disenfranchising a lot of voters. And of course, Governor Walker's response was, one of many, was, well, you need to show a photo ID to buy cough medicine, so why not this? I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that he did use the cough medicine analogy. In my response to that is, that's fine, but if you're buying it at Walgreens or Morton's at one location in, say, Appleton, because they're not saying we're not going to sell it to you because you live in Oshkosh. This, I believe, does disenfranchise a lot of students who don't necessarily change their addresses when they go to school. I think it's really going to cause some problems.
It has the potential to cause problems. I think the true issue is, and this still have to be vetted, is also the issue of a poll tax. If it costs money, if you have a Wisconsin driver's license, you can't get a Wisconsin ID. Do you have to pay to replace it every time you update your address? Are they going to just accept that little sticker that some people have on the back of the there's these administrative things we don't know yet. with what has been passed. But I think the biggest concern is there are, I think 9 out of the 50 states require photo ID at this point. So it's not as if all states do that.
Right.
But I'm not quite sure how they've each jumped over that hurdle of, is this a poll tax on people? What happens to senior citizens who move from their house to an apartment to a nursing home? And what's the timeline of that? Do they have to go through that? And is that the first thing they're thinking about?
Well, what about absentee balloting, absentee voting?
Right.
There's another issue.
So
Don't you think this is really a national Republican agenda to suppress votes for the 2012 presidential election in states like Wisconsin, where it's going to be a real test as to who wins? This is what it's all about.
Well, what I believe is that every voter that is eligible to vote should be able to vote with ease.
Yeah.
That we are in a day and age where we have had such apathy and such lack of participation by people that you want people to vote. And I think the more difficult you make it for people to access their rights, it has the potential to disenfranchise
Don't you think
people.
they're going to suppress votes for the 2012 presidential election in Wisconsin by the passage of this bill?
Well, we'll see how that's implemented. I mean, I think it has that potential.
It's law. I mean, it's going to be.
I guess my concern is, it comes into effect, most of the provisions come into effect April of 2012. My real concern that I don't think anybody's thinking about, I think right now everybody's operating under this assumption that, shoot, if I got to go to the DMV, I'll just go over there, get the new one, what's the big deal, right? I think that's average conception. The thing I'm concerned about is on the federal level, they've recently passed a Real ID legislation, which makes the driver's licenses more sophisticated with the information they carry regarding national databases. So that means the driver's license themselves, as each state becomes compliant with the Real ID law, have to have more sophisticated coding in them and swiping in the magnetic strips. So it's my understanding that there are states right now that have already implemented that legislation, and what happens when you go get your license there is they give you a photocopy and then they send you your new one in the mail like 3 weeks later. So if we have just suddenly put this in place with this belief that you can just go get a new one, it's not a big deal.
You're not going to get it right away.
You're not going to get it right away. And so that's my...
And that goes right back to your point again.
Right, and that's my fear. And if there's a way to reconcile these two things, I think as elected officials we have to take, now that is law, we have to take that very seriously. And then I think we also have to reevaluate, do we charge for these things? Because I think that becomes a poll tax. That becomes something that's potentially unconstitutional.
This does not apply to the recall election, though, does it?
Well, there's the residency requirement that was changed in there. The residency requirement...
for more than 10 days.
It's now 28 days.
Now 28 days, okay.
And the other issue has to do with early voting. My understanding is that previously you were able to early vote up till the Monday before the Tuesday election, and I think
They've restricted it.
they've moved it back a couple days, and that may be for administrative feasibility, but it's lessened
The time that
ease.
you have to vote early.
Yeah, the ease of it. If you think, oh shoot, I forgot I was going to be out of town, you can't just go down there on Monday before the election, I don't think anymore. So,
See, it just seems to me like they've once again rushed through some legislation without really looking at things and thinking things through and solving some of the issues that you've just been talking about here. And this seems to be a trend that the Walker administration is setting, and the Republicans. Hate to categorize things and generalize things, but
I think you just say it's the
way it is.
administration in power. It is the administration, and that's the
Yeah.
other thing for me as a political scientist and a lawyer. And the interesting thing about checks and balances is the three-legged stool, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch. It's interesting to me that the legislature is willing to give up so much power to the executive, and in a sense where normally you would think the legislative body would want to keep some authority for itself. But in the last few months, we've seen the addition of 34 new political appointees. We have seen them giving administrative veto power to the governor with regard to the Department of Justice and the Department of Public Instruction. I may be wrong about that, but administrative veto power over rules. And that's something that the governor has never had ability to do, and I think for those people who are very upset and thought that Governor Doyle overreached, because he used his executive power. Well, the legislature has now just given more executive power to the executive. And the thing is that may not always be a Republican or may not always be a Democrat. So me as a political scientist, I'm concerned about that. Because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, when you give up all that authority to one person, I don't think that's a good thing.
Go ahead.
I think the people of Wisconsin don't have enough power. I think we should have the right to amend the Constitution. In this state, only the legislature can amend the Constitution by passing it at 2 successive times without any changes. If people want power, don't you think they should have the right to amend their Constitution?
Well, you'll have to see if they can get the political will to get that amendment put in there.
It'll never happen. Term limits
Right.
would get a 90% vote. The legislature is never going to introduce a constitutional amendment for term limits. That's the last thing that they would ever do. But the Tea Party and other groups want power to the people. I think Wisconsin legislature, has too much power. I think the executive branch has too much power. And you can talk about check and balances between the 3 branches. What about check and balances with the people?
Well, what's interesting is this recall effort may be this
Maybe
great,
be the start.
be this great, and people, I think are amazed and have woken up, and I think they have been pushed so far that they're like, what option is available? And now they're realizing this is the option. And to have potentially 9 recalls at one point in history
Pretty historic, isn't it?
is probably why the state and the nation are watching,
No, I
because
think
it is this affront of checks and balances have failed, so the people are now looking for their alternatives.
Jess, what would you say to people who are maybe sitting on the fence post? I don't know too many who are these days.
There are, believe it or not,
I know there are.
I'm finding them.
I
and
know,
I'm finding them.
but
So.
I think a lot of people are very clearly one side or the other. But for those folks who are sitting on the fence, what would you say to them as to why they should vote for Jessica King as opposed to re-electing Randy Hopper?
Well, I think it has a lot, again, to this frustration with democratic principles. People believe that, government should be open, transparent, accessible, deliberative, that we don't want sound bites anymore, that we don't believe in politicians, that we think we get handed a line all the time and no follow through. I think those people are Democrats. I think those people are Republicans. I think those people are Green Party. I think those people are unaffiliated. And I think they're really frustrated. And I think the challenge is every time I go to their door as an elected person and I'm asking them for something, I'm asking them for the vote. And I get my little 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes maybe to talk to them. And what I try to look back to now is I do have a record. I have a 4-year record of public service that is accessible, that is transparent, that people can see. They can see that I've been willing to take votes against special interests. They can see that I've been willing to cooperate with Republicans or Republican-leading local elected officials, even though we're in a nonpartisan body, when it was appropriate. I supported, along with Paul Esslinger, that idea that we need to reevaluate how our liquor licenses are quoted, or when it is more of a green issue or a Democrat issue. I've obviously worked with those issues. So I think what I tell people who are undecided, I say, look at my record, look at my work ethic, and evaluate that.
Okay, all right, very good. Thanks so much for being here. Also want to make mention of the fact that we did try to do an hour-long show with our current Senator, Randy Hopper. The show was scheduled. They did not have the courtesy or professionalism to call and say that they would not be showing up. They just simply didn't show up. So we will make one more attempt to do a show with Mr. Hopper. If that happens, it does. If not, so be it. They kind of blew it. And I personally find that kind of disorganization not a good thing for our current senatorial district. So anyway, that's my editorial comment.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck,
Thank
and
you.
we will see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.
Bye.